Well, thanks for joining me. Joining me today is Tim Perez, a forest ecologist at Living Carbon. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is Tim. I'm the lead carbon scientist at Living Carbon. I've got a background in forest ecology and how forests respond to climate change. I spent a lot of time in the tropics, hugging trees and measuring forests, and also throughout North America, but a lot of time in the New World, in the forest and studying plants.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, today I think we want to talk about assisted migration.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot about assisted migration. A lot of my previous academic research focused on how plants are responding to climate change. And now that I've transitioned into a role in the climate tech world, coming into this really interesting, like applied space where it's a lot of the ecological theory can actually be applied to solve important questions and problems dealing with how future forests, grasslands, ecosystems are going to exist in future hotter climates.
So we should probably start by just like defining what assisted migration is for people. Do you have like a go-to definition yourself, or?
So yeah, I mean, you think of migration. Migration is typically it can be a bit of like a misnomer because migration implies that things are going to and from a place. So you think about birds migrating, it's like you think of geese going north and then coming south again in the winter. This migration of plants and trees is a bit slower in the time scale, but I think that's an important component. They do move north or south or to areas that are colder or warmer based on their like temperature regimes or climatic envelopes, the temperatures that they operate most effectively in. But because it's such a long time scale, typically that trees migrate or move. It like some people argue about whether or not it's called migration. But in the context of assisted migration and forests, assisted migration is humans somehow helping plants or trees move to a place they weren't previously. I think that's the most basic definition. Then there's different types of assisted migration. So there's like population migration. So if you imagine like a distribution of plants, for example, let's think of like red maple. It has a really large distribution on the in the eastern U.S. From Florida all the way up to Maine, into Canada. So you can take individuals from the southern portion of that range, say Florida, and move them north to New York or Maine, wherever, and you're moving individuals of a like subpopulation into a new subpopulation of that species. So that's like assisted population migration. There's also range expansion. So let's use the red maple again. Let's say that you take individuals or a subpopulation and move it outside of the current distribution of where that red maple is. So let's say for example, just as a hypothetical, like the red maple range limit is the U.S.-Canadian border, and then what like range expansion would be is taking some of those red maples and moving them past that border. And then there's also, moving species or individuals of the same species to like new areas that they may not have existed before, but are still within their range of potential growing conditions.
Okay. So you and I we're talking about trees usually, and I guess plants in general. Has anyone ever, do people talk about this for animals?
For animals, assisted migration, give me a second to think about it. I don't think about animals too much. I'm sort of like,
we don't care about it. There's no carbon in there, so.
Yeah, I mean, people move animals around all the time.
Yeah, but in the context of climate change, I mean, they can kind of move themselves, right?
Right, exactly. So, like plants can move, but it's typically with seed, right? And so you're like leapfrogging seed.
Okay.
Animals generally can move themselves, like we talked about birds, which are pretty mobile. Then, caribou migrations are a big thing in like boreal and Arctic areas. But yeah, just completely blanked on the animal question.
Oh well, I mean, it wasn't in the notes, so yeah. I mean, certainly there's plenty of instances of like animals moving themselves. Like I mean, back east, everyone was always worried about lobsters moving up the coast, and they have. Like there used to be lobsters down in Massachusetts, and there's not anymore. And so that's yeah,
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm like lobsters are moving like into using lobsters over to like deeper, colder
yeah,
waters. So it's like the same. It's the same concept. Species are trying to stay within like their physiological like operational limits.
mm,
So the places that they like. Then in terms of like assisted migration with animals, I guess that would only really become applicable if there was something that was really like dispersing limited.
mm,
I don't know, maybe certain salamanders or something, or
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, not our
Yeah,
problem. So yeah, I wanted to kind of ask, like, why is this important? Like, what are some of the pros and cons, and what happens if we don't do it?
right. So the two things that come to mind are, well, ecosystem services. So um, if trees aren't capable, and like obviously we tend to be thinking in terms of trees, but this really applies to any plant. Um, but if species aren't migrating and um, fulfilling ecosystem services, or operating this like these massive carbon cycles, vegetative cycles, nutrient cycles, or sorry, water cycles, nutrient cycles. But yeah, I would just say like really large scale, um, you start to see dysfunction of ecosystem services or alteration of ecosystem services.
Mm,
Um, for example, like if you have fewer trees or less density in your forests on really large scales, that could alter not only the carbon cycle but like water cycles, right? And there's evidence of rainfall regimes being altered in across the Amazon.
yeah,
So like, trees transpire, and that causes a lot of moisture to be released into the atmosphere, and then that moisture moves to a different region of the Amazon and precipitates. But there's actually been like measured decreases in rainfall as a result of deforestation. Now, deforestation isn't necessarily a consequence of species not migrating, but people are hypothesizing that as temperature increases, it can cause large-scale tree mortality, and when that happens, then that's when you might expect some of these like sort of scary scenarios to occur. Um, I was Go ahead.
oh yeah. I mean, I got my degree in Maine, so I always go back to those forest types. But they would always threaten us with like red spruce, for example, not being able to survive the warmer temperatures. And if red spruce isn't there and somebody doesn't move another tree into its place, what's going to happen to the forest? It's
Right. So like yeah, and like I often think about the Amazon. There's some papers that came out recently about like Amazonian tipping points,
mm,
where the Amazon rainforest could actually change into a savanna ecosystem,
mm,
and like there are lots of positive feedbacks that occur, to maintain forest, or once you get into what's called like a different stable state, um, it can push the trajectory towards a different type of ecosystem, like a savanna. Um, but like other examples that are closer to home of like tree mortality is like the mountain pine beetle in the Rockies,
mm,
and that causing like increased runoff, which decreases stream and water quality in watersheds in affected areas. Um, but if there aren't other species coming and replacing the dying species, yeah, it's like what happens. So that can lead to something like it can lead to biodiversity loss in places like the Amazon or lowland areas. It can lead to biotic attrition, which is like loss of species, decreases in species diversity, um, which then again sort of like feeds back into ecosystem services. So like each, if you think of species each as like sort of components of the machine, if you start pulling out those components, the machine starts breaking down.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think also the importance of it touches on, I mean, beyond the ecology of the thing, it touches on every aspect of forests, including local economies, because you know you don't necessarily if you're really dependent on timber,
mm-hmm.
and your primary timber species are no longer going to be doing that well with climate change, you probably want to replace them with something that will.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the economic component is something that's directly. I mean, all these things directly impact humans, but I think that's probably at the forefront of people's minds more so than like biodiversity loss, which is sort of the world we live in. But
Yeah.
yeah, how many species can people name, and how many like insects do they know exist in the forest? Or some it's a lot, but I would wager that the average human doesn't really know that much about the diversity at their doorstep.
Yeah. So touching more on like why this is important for us, like why it's important for human beings to help with this. Um, why can't trees do it themselves?
Well, like why can't, I mean, trees can't migrate themselves. So like there's this cascade of like ecosystem services and biodiversity, which all like directly and indirectly affect humans. So like that's inherently we should care. There's like lots of economic reasons, like you just mentioned, but we should care because it's also a problem we can help solve. It's a massive problem. Like if you think about all the species that would potentially need to be moved, it's a massive problem, and we're only just starting to think about how we can do that on large scales. And like I know the Forest Service is doing some of this. I know like some private timber companies are already practicing some of this, but that data isn't available. But it's a problem that we can begin to start solving, and we can use previous changes in climate like glaciations, as well as like existing data sets to inform how we could do this, the rate at which we need to do this, in order to maintain forest structure, provide value to landowners, and help maintain the forest industry that has been so important for so many Ethiopians.
Hmm. So it's not the most contentious topic, but it is a little contentious sometimes. And I think that's because people look at the ecosystems that they have and they don't want them to go away. Uh, what's your experiences with like the contention out there around assisted migration?
I think it's sort of like fear of the unknown. Like we don't know what will happen if we bring one species into an area that hasn't occurred before. There, people have been studying like what happens when you move one population into a different population. You have things called like inbreeding or outbreeding depression. So like inbreeding depression is typically when you have small populations that are like relatively similar in size, or relatively similar in their genetic variation. And so these things start breeding, and it actually reduces their ability to like reproduce and grow. On the other side of the spectrum, you have outbreeding depression, and outbreeding depression is a potential concern for like assisted migration. So you bring, like maybe let's use this red maple example again. You bring red maple from Florida that's like maybe adapted to hotter temperatures up to like New York, that where species or like those individuals are adapted to colder temperatures, and then maybe over a few generations you have like interbreeding between these two subpopulations, and like the like preference for hotter climate mixes with the preference for cold climate in some way, and like, reduces their ability to tolerate like either extreme. Um, so like, that's sort of an example that I made up, but um, when you bring two populations, the point is when you bring two populations together, the result might not always be favorable. Sometimes it can be detrimental. So,
yeah, that's an interesting point. It feels a little less contentious around like population migration within species because it's still the same trait for people.
yeah.
But I mean, here we live in Washington, and people I think often talk about redwoods, like bringing redwoods up the coast, which I think is a great idea. But no doubt, it's a totally different ecosystem than what's here right now.
Right.
And it's to some extent maybe like giving up.
Giving up on the existing, right? Like,
yeah, to some extent, it's like kind of like throwing in the towel and like maybe.
Well, I mean, yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I once read like if you're concerned about like the survival of like a plant species, then introduce it to the horticultural trade, which is like a different way to preserve genetic information, but horticulture can take many forms. Like people have been moving the plant species they like wherever they go. Like apples are from like Kazakhstan, right? So, and like in the Northeast where I grew up, apples are a major part of the landscape, and it's like hard to think about apple trees not being there. Even weeping willows, to some extent, those are European, I believe. So, like landscapes are constantly changing, and as we mentioned earlier, trees are also migrating over the course of like a couple human generations. Like your landscape may change. So I think the idea of your landscape and your surroundings changing is scary, but or uncomfortable at least. But I think it's important to keep in mind like they're always changing, and we can help them change if we want, to maintain forests. That means we may have to expect a couple different species in our forests that maybe weren't there previously. But like going back to the question, is it like giving up on redwoods? Like I think it'd be giving up on redwoods if we just say, well, all of the habitat for these species.
Well, I don't know if it's giving up on redwoods, but it feels like maybe giving up on whatever we're moving redwoods into. So, like red spruce was the example I had in Maine, where it's like it's not doing well up there because it gets too hot in the summertime now. And if we start planting hardwoods in place of red spruce, then like feels like maybe you're giving up on the red spruce habitat, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think giving up on the red spruce habitat is like, in theory, like the habitat or like the climatic preference is moving. The species might not be moving fast enough, and probably isn't moving fast enough to keep up with where its ideal climate is moving to. But I think giving up is just like not helping that species move. As I sometimes think of humans as like Ents, right, from Lord of the Rings, like shepherds, and I do think we have some responsibility to shepherd animals and plants to benefit them and us in certain circumstances. So I feel like giving up on a plant would just be like not doing any mitigation, like mitigative, is that a word, actions.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's keep the analogy, and we can cut this. But okay, so red spruce, it's not doing great in Maine, and we're going to replace it with hickory or something like that to some extent. And so we would then be kind of relying on the Canadians to just kind of expand the range north and hoping that it's. I mean, isn't there a stronger? Isn't this more likely to happen with like commercial species than it is with non-commercial ones? And if red spruce weren't a commercial species, wouldn't that be a bit of a risk that we're pushing them out of their last remaining habitat?
Like risk in what sense?
I guess in the sense that like we're making it's already fairly difficult for them to survive, and now we're introducing competitors to the space.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So you're saying like not moving the red spruce and introducing other species, competitive species, to the red spruce habitat.
Yeah, is there an obligation every time you move a species? Like if we were to move redwoods to Washington, do we have to now have an obligation to move Doug fir further north?
That's a good question. I think like I think that is a question that comes down to like local communities.
Mm.
So if local communities want and or are okay with new species coexisting with them, I think that's their call. At some point, there's some like, practical issues dealing with like the scale of the introduction. Then you probably have to get governments involved, but like on an individual scale, people do this, right? Like
Yeah.
people, like there are redwoods planted in BC. Like there are some planted in like the park. What's the name of the park? Like
BC.
oh, Stanley Park. There's like there's redwoods like planted in Stanley Park, and like you can drive down the interstate here and you can see redwoods off the side of the road. So like people are doing it. It's just like not massive scale. So in like a very diffuse way, maybe some of that is already happening, right? Because maybe there's people like in northern BC that are like, oh well, I like this tree. I'm going to plant it in my yard in like Smithers or something.
Yeah, 50 years ago they wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah. So, but in terms of like large scale, I think that's an interesting question, and there would probably have to. I would say depends on what local communities want.
I suspect they want timber. I guess that would be my concern. Is that if it's so the U.S. Forest Service is really putting a lot of thought into it, but like could this be kind of used as a guise to introduce kind of quasi-invasive species?
Yeah, I think that's a risk that it's real. It's a really important question, and I think we need more data to adequately determine whether or not a species would be invasive. There's lots of ways to potentially quantify invasiveness, but none are have like 100% like predictive ability, right? I remember seeing a rubric for like if your plant like checks all these boxes, it's probably an invasive species. And it was a published paper, and it was like interesting. I'm not sure how much it's been used. It seems like it'd be a useful resource. But I think that species, I forget, there's some statistic that's like only of like 100 species that get introduced, maybe only one or two are invasive. So that said, like those invasive species can have like outsized economic impacts. So there's definitely trade-offs and risks. And like, how do you determine which species won't be invasive, or which species will just be naturalized and sort of benign? I don't have a good answer to that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there isn't an answer, especially as everything's changing. I wanted to touch on like to bring this kind of more home to people. Like, what species have you heard of this being done for the most?
So there's lots of different species. Like, well, you mentioned redwood. Like that one comes to mind. There's laws against moving redwood seed at large scale.
Is there?
I think so. I think it has to do something with like the natural heritage of the area. Like we'll have to fact check that.
Okay.
But that's like.
Okay, so redwood's definitely one, and I would guess like both coastal and giant sequoias.
Yeah.
And then coming from Maine again, like I've certainly heard of people wanting to migrate like East Coast hardwoods further north.
Right.
So replacing the spruce and the fir with like hickory and black cherry and stuff. Um,
I think like all the like typical valuable hardwoods, like maple is something you hear like being moved to places where not only it's productive for timber, but also for maple syrup. Um, but yeah, there's large like transplant experiments happening now that the Forest Service is experimenting with. So, and those all tend to be like valuable timber species, and they have a publication that sort of explains that experiment that they're doing right now. So, but in terms of like specific examples of like species X being moved here, like I can point you towards one example, but
I think well, you made a really good case with the maple syrup because the maple syrup industry relies on pretty sharp swings in temperature. That's becoming a lot more difficult, and so like the whole industry is basically having to move north, even if the maple trees themselves still grow in the south.
Yeah.
I've heard of a pretty textbook example, stinking cedar. Have you ever heard of that one?
Yeah, I think that's Torreya.
Yeah.
That's a genus Torreya.
But why would you call it that when you know it's stinking cedar?
Yeah, so it's like this small sort of relic gymnosperm that exists in like sort of understory environments in like northern central Florida and Georgia.
Yeah, it's like three swamps or something like like really, really.
Yeah, really small distribution. They think it got stuck there, like it failed to migrate north after the last glaciation because it likes colder areas, but somehow it failed to like track the colder temperatures up the east coast, and as a result, it's sort of decreasing its population. It's not doing well, but there's like massive efforts, or there's very enthusiastic efforts to try to move this species north, but there's pushback because it's introducing a species into a new area outside of a range. It would be an example of this like range expansion.
Yeah.
Although the species, the Torreya, the stinking cedar, it can tolerate those colder temperatures at those more northern latitudes in northern states, but who's going to plant it? Who's liable for any unseen circumstances that result from it being moved?
Yeah. And it's basically like a U, right?
Yeah, it's small. Like I don't think there's any real commercial value of it. It's just sort of an interesting species. Again, it's interesting from a horticultural perspective, and people like move it into their yards. But in terms of like large transplants, or transplanting large numbers, and trying to increase the viable population size, that's where conservationists and ecologists start to get a little concerned.
And they kind of did the same thing with like meta sequoia, right? Like the Chinese.
Yeah, the Dawn redwood. Yeah. That's like another horticultural species that is like you can find it everywhere.
Yeah.
At least in the northern hemisphere, I'm sure southern hemisphere. But I just that's a tree I just imagine being on college campuses as like that one cool tree.
But it comes from like very few like hidden valleys in China, and we've kind of brought it out to the rest of the world.
The same thing with ginkgo too.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay.
So I think ginkgos were trees that were like sort of discovered in these remote monasteries, and then horticulturists were like, "Oh, this is bizarre. Let's plant it everywhere."
Cool. Yeah. It's cool that you mentioned glaciation because I think that was one of the big points that I wanted to make, which is that like, we've been talking about like trees do move on their own. Mm-hmm. They don't move very fast,
right.
And clearly they don't move fast enough to keep up with climate change. But like many of the, I think, assisted migrations that we're discussing, like I think a lot of the time those trees were there before the last glaciation, like 10,000 years ago. Like Washington used to have, I think, a much more diverse set of trees before glaciers moved in and wiped out a lot of them.
Yeah, yeah. I think like so, like glaciate, like the Earth has gone through many cycles of glaciations, and has gone through like decreases in temperature and rebounds in temperature to like I don't know what we consider ambient. I'm not a paleobotanist, but
I
so
wanted to be one. Didn't work out. There's no money in that. Stay away from it, kids. I mean, it's
yeah, we've talked about Gilboa, right?
yeah.
That's awesome.
We'll do our next video
yeah.
on the Gilboa fossil beds.
Yeah, but yeah, you like so we're in Bellingham, Washington now, and there are fossil beds around here that have what? How old are they? Like there's like a 1 to 2 million.
Most of them go back like 55 million
Okay.
when the Chuckanuts were formed.
Okay.
But there are some of the more recent ones.
Okay, so how old is Racehorse Falls?
Yeah, that's the 55 million.
Okay, 55 million. So I remember you said you found some like ferns there. Is it like Angiopteris?
Palms.
Palms. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then there's beech also, which is not really native to this area. Yeah, you'll find all kinds of like kind of more like species that you kind of think of in like the southeastern United States.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I remember finding some like palm fossils up in the mountains, like near Yellowstone, when I worked there years ago. There was like some pleated leaves I found. That was really cool. But I'm jealous. I haven't found any palm fossils here yet.
Yeah, well, I'll show you the spots.
But I did find some beech and like Metasequoia and the Dawn Redwood in Vancouver when I was living up there. So yeah, like those species don't occur there anymore, and like paleobotanists can sort of infer what the climates were in those areas based on the species that can be found in the fossil record or like fossilized pollen that exists for a long time. You can start to understand the species that existed in an area. Then from that, you can determine the approximate climate in that area. And then if you go through the different geological layers, the bedrock, or I guess sediments, you can look at the changes in the like pollen concentrations. You can look at changes in the types of like leaf fossils to get an understanding of how the plant communities have changed through time. So that's like one way we know that glaciations have occurred is because the fossil beds will have a bunch of species that are affiliated with warmer climates, and then you'll go a little bit higher, and then there'll be species that are associated with colder climates, and then that suggests there's glaciation. There's lots of that in like lake sediments. That's a great place you can look at pollen, and based on the changes in the species composition, we can understand the rates at which the climate was changing as well. So we can understand how fast glaciations occurred, or how slowly, or how plants migrated back to fill those warmer areas after glaciers receded, and those took thousands of years for those migrations to happen, right? But with anthropogenic climate change, we're orders of magnitude faster with the warming that's happening. So it's sort of a first in Earth's history experiment at this rate. We've had like cataclysmic increases in temperature in the past from like associated with other mass extinction events like meteors or volcanic eruptions, but not quite like what we're experiencing now.
So, I mean, maybe ethically we can sleep a little better at night if we know that like the trees used to live there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this idea of we have this ethical idea of, well, we never experienced this species existing here, so we shouldn't do that.
Mm.
And I think I don't know if it's cliche at this point, but I think it's an important point. Um, it's a distinction that that way of thinking is like humans are separating themselves from the ecological equation. And we tend to think of nature as something other than us, but we are part of nature, and we, like many organisms, manipulate the environment around us to suit our needs.
Mm.
So I think when you think about it in that way, it's a little less concerning, or there's maybe fewer ethical concerns. But that's not to say like we should, because there's still consequences of doing that, like negative economic, environmental impacts that are harmful in the long run.
You mean if we don't do it?
I'm saying like if you introduce a species that winds up being like
okay,
invasive,
yeah,
like we should do our due diligence to make sure that what we're doing isn't going to cause problems for us. Like we should be like mitigating or improving the way things are, not making them worse.
Yeah.
I guess that's also subjective, but that's like for philosophers to debate.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think a lot of people's fear is just like humans have introduced plenty of species in the past, sometimes intentionally so, to improve the environment. And everyone loves to point to cane toads in Australia, right?
Yeah.
But we've gotten it wrong because we haven't done our homework at the time.
Yeah.
And have we learned our lesson, or are we just kind of racing ahead?
I think more data is always valuable. I think with some species, we can have fairly high confidence that we're not going to be making things worse, and in fact, we'll be improving things. Like a lot of the hardwood species that we mentioned earlier, like hickories, maples, that sort of thing, ashes. Um, I don't think there'll be lots of negative environmental impacts from introducing those species, but um, there's always a caveat. So I think it's important to acknowledge that caveat, but don't be afraid of it.
Yeah. Well, they are trees, so you can cut them down pretty quickly sometimes. It's a lot easier than like a toad.
Yeah, and like trees, they're fairly easy to manage even on like large scales.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, I think there are some examples of them going amok. I think like California eucalyptus is an example.
Yeah.
Where they're, I think they're labeled as invasive now. They're really bad fire hazards. They compete with the other vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, I think like it's fairly easy to walk back our mistakes if we make them. Right?
I think so. I mean, yeah, the invasive species are um, a real issue, but there are like a handful of examples of species that have been introduced. Like I spent a lot of time in Florida doing my dissertation, and like Florida is an amazing hotbed for invasive species, like of all kinds, plants, animals, fish. It's really cool from like an ecoevolutionary standpoint. There's like a lot of things to study there, but another eucalypt there is Melaleuca, which they used like sort of similarly to the eucalyptus in California, but it was I think used as like a timber species, but also used to sort of soak up and drain parts of the Everglades for development. And like these are just like incredibly dense stands in these trees. It's almost like they don't obey the laws of like thinning rules or like density dependence. They're just like so packed in there. It's really interesting.
I wanted to point people to some resources. There's been a bunch of really cool papers. One of them that I think is really cool is if you're on the U.S. East Coast, there's something called the Tree Atlas. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah.
So they've actually like mapped out pretty much every major species on the East Coast, and you can go online and see the maps of where they are today and where they'll be in 2100 under different climate scenarios.
The U.S. Forest Service
Yeah,
maps, yeah.
yeah. So I'll link to those if you're curious of like which species are maybe the most vulnerable or most applicable.
Yeah.
Are there other resources like that? You know,
I really like those maps. I think there's like a lot of other there's a lot of data that's provided in those maps to suggest the confidence with the confidence of the projections.
Mm.
So I do think they're just really interesting to look at too, to see like what can shift and the magnitude of the shift. But yeah, no, I think those are really cool maps.
Mm. And then outside that, I think the USDA, I think, has also mapped out U.S. Hardiness zones today and then into the future as well.
Yeah, well, I know they just updated their.
Yeah, they changed them, which is a little scary. I mean,
that's good
in action. Yeah. So potentially, if you were looking to like play around and not introduce, but move a species further up, you could maybe look at the hardiness zone.
Yeah, usually you can just do some googling and find some hardiness zones. For most commercial timber species, that should be pretty easy. For things that are less common, you might have to do some like climatic envelope analyses or species distribution models. But yeah, there's lots of tools for being able to do those. So.
And then I think most trees, like even if the environment isn't ideally suited for them today, like sassafras doesn't grow well in Maine at all today. But like if you nanny it, it'll get to a full size tree.
Yeah.
And arguably, 40 years from now, by the time it is a full size tree, then it'll be happier.
Yeah, totally. There's actually like this reminds me of this like idea of dispersal limitation. So like when I was in college, there was a banana tree growing outside of like our greenhouse in Vermont. So and it survived, like the roots survived through the winter. The vegetative above ground portion died back, but things can survive. And in that case of that, it's not reproducing, but that's not to say things can't if you bring them to that spot. So maybe that like Torreya, the stinking cedar, just because it's in a southern like distribution in Florida and Georgia, doesn't mean it can't exist someplace else, and it just needs to get moved there. So
yeah. Okay, well that's kind of what I have in my notes. Were there other topics that you want to talk about?
I feel like there's a more intelligent way to talk about like migration rates, because I was a co-author on a paper and we looked at migration rates of ecoregions throughout the New World. So what you do is you get species distributions from public databases, and you say, okay, like how are the compositions within this ecoregion changing, like the average temperature of like the mean species average, or the average, what were we calling it? We call it the community temperature index. So like, you basically calculate the mean temperature, and then for an ecoregion, you weigh it by the abundance of the species that occur there, and you see how that changes through time. And it's like a very distinct signal that all of these ecoregions, or the majority of these ecoregions, are thermophilizing or thermophilizing. They're getting warmer.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's happening. Like, trees are migrating at a slower rate than how climate is warming. So they're doing it. They just need like a little bit of a push.
Yeah.
In some instances, and it's not always that species are tracking warmer temperatures. Sometimes species are going to wetter areas because there's like higher evapotranspirative demand or something like that. So there's like lots of variables that influence like where a species might exist. It's not just like a hot cold thing.
Mm.
So, and there's a lot more research coming out showing that vapor pressure deficit is actually really important for photosynthesis and growth. So that's something that is going to be changing a lot with climate change. And even in very wet areas like the tropics, really high vapor pressure deficit is typically like associated with really dry areas, but really low vapor pressure deficit could also be a result of really hot wet areas. And when that happens, it's almost like leaves are suffocating and you can't transpire. So that's a really interesting like ecophysiological climate related problem.
So just for like people's reference, like how fast do trees move on their own?
Okay, so based on some like paleontological pollen studies, it looks like there's a range, but it can be like some pollen studies suggest that rates of warming or migration can be like 100 to 1,000 meters per year, which is like pretty fast and large. Now, on that scale, like species might be able to keep up with climate change, but other like estimates based on inferred molecular rates is like less than 100 meters per year. So
we don't really know.
There's a large range, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I think it depends on the method you're using, but they tend to be like pretty slow, I think, in general.
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Do we know how fast, like, up the eastern seaboard, the plant hardiness zones are migrating?
I don't know. That's a good question. That'd be a good thing to look up. I think I looked up like the average. So the U.S. has like experienced roughly like 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming over the past 150 years, and that comes out to be 0.008 degrees Celsius per year. So when you put all of this like together, trees would have to move something like 1.3 kilometers north each year.
Right. That's not very good.
Yeah. And that's like way larger than like many of like the dispersal kernels that seeds have.
Yeah.
So
they kind of have to leapfrog from one generation to the next as they go.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to take forever. So if you imagine like an oak tree with a large acorn, those acorns aren't going very far, right?
It sounds like there are trees that migrate a lot faster than others.
There could be. Like if there's species that have seeds that are easily transported, or like birds are moving the seeds, they might have higher migration rates. Whole discipline of dispersal ecology that could be investigating this.
Yeah.
Or humans.
Well, we move pretty fast.
We can move really fast.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on the new podcast or whatever it is.
Yeah, what's the podcast called?
No, I'm just going to post this on my YouTube channel. I don't know. I should do a podcast. I mean, I think a lot more people listen to that.